Ukraine is winning. Now let's finish the job. That's the title of a recent piece put out by Ben Wallace, a former United Kingdom defense minister. And I thought the timing that this came out was pretty interesting. Now, the timing, not in the sense of that announcement last week that the UK might be putting boots on the ground in Ukraine. They're not going to. I think that whole story was kind of blown out of proportion. It sounds like the defense minister suggested that that could be something that they would be doing. And the prime minister has quickly stepped in to say, hey, there are no plans to put British troops on the ground in Ukraine. They're just floating it out there as a possibility of a thing that they might consider sometime in the future. But that, of course, didn't stop news outlets from running the headline of British troops headed to Ukraine, and that speculation all started. Anyways, that doesn't appear to be happening for now. The reason that I thought the timing here was interesting was more related to the averted government shutdown here in the United States. So I saw a lot of commentary bringing out some points in kind of different ways that I really agreed with. And it was the idea that a major failure here in the United States since this war began, or even in the months leading up to it, is that we haven't had great messaging to the American people. And what they mean by that, and my take on that, is a kind of continual, a scheduled update, be it every quarter, every 6 months even, for that matter, a formal address talking about the war in Ukraine, talking about how it's going, what's the situation on the ground right now, what are the plans to move it forward, and what are we going to do in order to help. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody who is against support for Ukraine is going to get on board, or that 100% of the country is going to be in lockstep to see this thing through, but it hasn't been there really at all. Right, you've kind of got to dig through different statements and different press releases to kind of understand. I was telling my wife just the other night on this topic, this is a conflict I'm following every single day, and I can't succinctly put into words the overall U.S. strategy for this war. Right, it's vague at best, and it's coming from different directions, and we aren't going to send tanks no matter what. We're not going to send long-range missiles, and then we are going to send tanks, and it looks like ATACMS are going. It's like what. It's just back and forth and up and down. And I do agree with the sentiment that there could have been a lot of value in government officials stepping forward and saying, this is our plan, and essentially briefing where we think this is headed. And then, of course, the American people get to decide, is this something we're going to get behind? Is this something we have confidence in? So on and so forth. And I think Ben Wallace is at least starting that. That's what came to mind. So that was in the back of my mind. Then Ben Wallace's piece came out, and we'll run through it here. He says, Ukraine's counteroffensive is succeeding. Slowly but surely, the Ukrainian armed forces are breaking through the Russian lines, sometimes yard by yard, sometimes village by village. Ukraine has the momentum and is pressing forward. I would agree. I think to say the Ukrainian counteroffensive is succeeding requires a lot more context. Overall, Ukraine has retaken a lot of territory, but relative to what Russia captured at the beginning of the war up until the start of the counteroffensive, it's not a lot. It's something that needs context, right? It's the context that this war is going to go on for a long time, and the challenges in the battlefield, and how this is not going to be one operation and everything is wrapped up, which from my perspective, I feel like a lot of the debates about continuing support for Ukraine a lot of that is hinged on that idea of we're one weapon system away, or we're one aid package away, or we're just send F-16s and this whole thing will be over. And that's never really been the case. And continuing in that kind of how it's going, Wallace says, we have the chance to help finish this. The Russian army is cracking. Ukraine has learned new tactics to overcome horrendous minefields, and the Storm Shadow strikes are devastating Russian headquarters. We are witnessing the beginnings of the battle for Crimea. The comment on the Russian army is cracking, I think, is interesting, coming from a former defense minister. I mean, he's definitely had a lot of intel briefings. I don't know how tied in he is to all of that today, but it wasn't that long ago that he was one of the key members of the Ukrainian alliance here. There's a lot unknown about the Russian army right now. We don't know the strength of a lot of the reinforcements that they've pushed up to plug some of these gaps. And it does look like they've sent more and more of their troops forward to man that initial line of defense, as opposed to the second or third, or even staying in reserves. And if that's the case, it's likely they've suffered a pretty high level of attrition. Has it been enough for a breakthrough to happen at some point? And when I say a breakthrough, I don't mean that, a punch through the lines and then the lines restabilize there for a few weeks before something else happens, but a breakthrough in the sense of the Russian manning isn't there, and if Ukraine finds the right spot to actually press, there's no reinforcements to come in, and Ukraine can push armor through into the second or third layer of defense. Maybe. Just because we haven't seen it yet doesn't mean it won't happen, but there are a lot of questions about the current strength of the Russian army in Ukraine. He adds that we're witnessing the beginning of the battle for Crimea. I think this goes under the radar a lot. I think Ukraine is looking at this as not something that's going to happen in the next 3, 6, 9 months. This is a long-term fight. They're starving out the Russian military capabilities in Ukraine, or in Crimea, or at least trying to do so. Right? The strikes on the Kerch Bridge, which it's been a few months. I imagine we're probably going to see another one of those here before too long. And at some point, unless Russia is able to start knocking down more incoming missiles and destroying more of these unmanned surface vessels, it's likely over time that bridge is going to go. They're also attacking airports or airfields in Crimea. They're attacking ships in dry dock. They're attacking the Black Sea Fleet headquarters. There's a lot of targets, a lot of big targets being hit in Crimea. That's, I think very loosely you could consider that a shaping operation, but in this context, it's possible that shaping aspect goes on for, 6, 9, 12 months. Either way, there has been a very deliberate effort focused on Crimea recently that I think is kind of flying under the radar in terms of the overall context of the war. In terms of what needs to be done then to support Ukraine going forward, Wallace says we need to give Ukraine the support it requires to see this war to the end. As defense secretary, I was so often confronted with reasons not to, mainly by people who wouldn't know the difference between one end of a rifle and the other. A couple thoughts there. One, I wish you would have gone into more detail in the reasons that people are saying that we should not be, or in this case, the United Kingdom should not be supporting Ukraine through to the end. I think there's a lot of value in raising those issues and discussing them instead of just brushing them aside. And this is a very short article. I don't know that he was necessarily trying to brush it aside, but I think that's happened in the United States. I think some of the counter arguments have just been pushed aside and say, you're a Putin supporter, you don't like freedom, get out of here. When I think there's a lot more value in taking those head on and say, let's talk about those piece by piece, and maybe we'll still come out the other side on different ends, but let's at least have that conversation. And this next part here, I actually kind of disagree with. He says, he was given these reasons not to, mainly by people who wouldn't know the difference between one end of the rifle and the other. So war is so incredibly complex, like the most complicated thing we do as human beings, right? There's so many things that play into it. I don't think it is an entirely military endeavor. And especially when you get into something the scale of what's happening in Ukraine and the scale of the support being provided by countries like the United Kingdom, the United States, and others, it's not just a matter of military tactics. I mean, yeah, if you're talking about the tactics of storming a trench or how to align fires to a maneuver plan, 100% keep that in the military realm. You're going to find the subject matter experts there. But when you're talking about something as broad as the impact that this war is having on the world today and into the future, that is not an exclusively military endeavor. It's going to affect everything. So, in my opinion, is bring in as many people as possible, right? From all different walks of life, all different backgrounds, any number of different areas of expertise, because we're going to need it. This stuff's really complex. Wallace continues by saying Putin is desperately grasping at the final two things that can save him: time and the splitting of the international community. And the best way to keep the international community together is the demonstration of success. I agree with that first part, that two things playing in Putin's favor right now is time and the splitting of the international community. But I think those are kind of, heavily intertwined. And when it comes to the best way to keep the international community together, which is so challenging when you really think about it, we take it for granted that there's these alliances all around the world. But the idea that two countries with very different cultures and different histories, different languages, even in a lot of cases, are somehow able to come together for a common goal in a different country, that's wild when you think about it, right? We just get used to it. But the fact that multiple nations are on board to support a different nation is pretty substantial. But I don't think the best way to do that is necessarily the demonstration of success. I think that's a thing to show where Ukraine is succeeding on the battlefield. But to me, again, going back to the very opening part of this video, I think the most important aspect are those conversations with the domestic audience. Here in the United States, nobody's going to say that we should do one thing or another because the United Kingdom is doing it, or because Poland is doing it. Like it's going to hinge on the conversations between our elected officials, our government officials, and the population. And I think that's, I can't speak for every country, but I imagine that's probably the case in a lot of places. Now, I'm kind of focused in this article on the things that Wallace is talking about, the United States, United Kingdom, and external actors can do to support the war. But he doesn't completely absolve Ukraine from their role they play here, of course. He adds that the average age of the soldiers at the front is over 40, saying perhaps it is time to reassess the scale of Ukraine's mobilization. That has been very tricky to understand throughout this whole war. what does mobilization look like in Ukraine? How many people are in the armed forces? Who is permitted to not serve? And what is a critical role for the defense industry? Because it's not that clear, right? It's not every 22-year-old has to be in uniform. What if that 22-year-old is manufacturing drone parts, right? Like, you need that person to be filling that role. But it's really not being publicly clear, I'll say, the scope of Ukraine's mobilization. And Wallace concludes by saying the world is watching to see if the West has the resolve to stand up for our values in the rules-based system. What we do now for Ukraine will set the direction for all of our security for years to come. I actually really like that last sentence. What we do now for Ukraine will set the direction for all of our security for years to come. I think the arguments at this point, most of the arguments, the loudest arguments, are kind of on the two extremes. You have some people saying it will do nothing. It will have no impact at all, because Russia will take a little bit of territory in the east, and that'll be that. We'll move on. It won't impact us here in the United States. And other arguments that this is step one and Putin won't stop. He'll push into Poland and Germany's next kind of thing. Look out. Putin's on a rampage. So I think Wallace does a good job of, rather than playing into either one of those extremes, because we have no idea, right? You can speculate all you want, and you can predict where things would go, but we don't really know until something like that actually happens. So I think he did a good job kind of staying broad with it, because I think it's very fair to say that what we do for Ukraine will set the direction for our security for years to come. But overall, I think it was a good piece put out by Wallace. I kind of wonder if he saw some of those comments about how this type of conversation wasn't happening in the United States, so he went ahead and did it, because it's going to be a good thing for any country, really. The only thing I wish he would have put in here that he didn't, but to be fair, nobody's really putting this in official publications, is what does the end of the war look like? In the headline here, he says, now let's finish the job. So what does finishing the job look like to Ben Wallace? Now, I don't know if the reason that topic, which I think is so important to the overall conversation, I don't know if the reason that it's not coming out is because people can't agree on it. Governments can't agree on what that would look like. If they genuinely don't know, we're just like, we'll see what happens when we get there. Or if it's something that's so aggressive that putting it out there could, hamper overall support for the cause. I don't know. Again, I think that's a really important part of the conversation, and it doesn't seem to be getting that much attention. I'd like to see that at least a little bit going forward. But that's all I got for now. I will link this article as well as a link to the national security sit reps I put out on Substack in the description below. It's 7 to 10 of the top national security stories each week, along with a few podcast recommendations. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.